Today we're going to be talking about natural selection. Natural selection is the main mechanism that causes populations to evolve. It's not the only mechanism, but it is the primary mechanism, the one that is most commonly seen. A mechanism just means that a method or a way that something occurs. So this is how most cases of evolution happen. Okay? Remember that evolution is genetic change within a population over time. In general, populations tend to evolve to be better adapted to their environment. Adapted just means better able to survive and reproduce. And when we look across the natural world at the humongous variation of organisms that live out there, we see amazing adaptations. In any ecosystem you look at, you can find amazing adaptations of animals, plants, fungus, bacteria, anything, to be able to survive and reproduce better. So here's just a couple examples. This is a moth that lives in the tropics. It has a very, very long tongue, and it has that very long tongue so that it can access the nectary of an orchid with a very, very long nectar spur. Okay? And here, this guy here is a tiger. That tigers have stripes on them, and I think you can see why with this picture, because it makes it well adapted to hanging out in the grasses, nice and camouflaged when it's hunting. Okay, so the question is, how does this happen, right? This does not happen just because organisms need a new trait to become better adapted. Just like you can't change any of your genetically determined characteristics just because you would like to, the same thing is true of natural populations. Instead, this process called natural selection happens. Okay, so we're going to go through natural selection. In general, it's a very general definition of natural selection. It's the idea that individuals within a population with better traits survive longer and, I'm just going to underline, reproduce more than everyone else. This results in populations with traits that help them survive and reproduce over time. Okay? And results in the result is that populations adapt, becoming better suited to their environment over time. Okay, so I underline reproduce because it's all about reproduction when we're talking about natural selection, because it's all about passing genes on, better genes. All right, so first, just a very brief history. I really recommend that you read this section in your book about Darwin and about his travels and how he came to understand how evolution works. There's a little bit in there about Alfred Wallace as well. He was a contemporary of Darwin's. This was in the mid-1800s. Both Darwin and Wallace separately, but at the same time, simultaneously came up with the idea of evolution by natural selection. Darwin is typically the one who's credited with this idea and often called the father of evolution because he put in a lot more time, a lot more research, and compiled a large amount of evidence for natural selection. And Wallace didn't do that. So it wasn't that his idea was wrong or that he didn't come up with it. It was just that Darwin had better evidence. And in the end, Wallace was a big supporter of Darwin and wanted to give him credit. Darwin did publish a very famous book called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection in 1859 that outlined his idea of how natural selection works and goes through a lot of examples. Okay, so Darwin, when he was thinking about this stuff, he went on a big long voyage for 5 years, saw a lot of different ecosystems, came back. He was a gentleman botanist, so he didn't have any other job that he had to do. So he spent his time on his estate doing research and thinking about natural communities and natural populations of organisms. Okay? And he created this logical chain of thought that leads us to understand how evolution by natural selection happens. Okay? He based his ideas on 4 postulates about natural populations. These were things that he observed to occur in nature. Okay? A postulate is simply a statement that's accepted for fact that you can base a scientific argument on. It's also like a basic principle. Okay? So these are 4 things that Darwin observed about natural populations that are accurate. Okay, one is that individuals within a population vary. They're not all the same. Traits are passed from parent to offspring. Some individuals fail to survive and reproduce, and survival and reproduction are not determined by chance. Okay, let's deal with these first two first. So individuals within a population vary, and traits are passed from parent to offspring. Okay, another way of saying this is that natural populations vary in genetically determined traits. Now, when Darwin was thinking about this stuff, he did not know about DNA. He did not know about genes. He did not know how genetics worked. They didn't know what was inside the cell that was controlling the traits. Okay, at the same time, Gregor Mendel was working, very far away for that time of, for that day and age, working that out. But of course, they didn't talk to each other or anything back then. Okay, so now we know that for many genes there are multiple alleles. Okay, these genes that control the traits that are genetically determined. Okay, and alleles are created through random mutations. Okay, alleles are not created when they are needed. They instead occur through random mutations. If they happen to create a trait that is beneficial, then it can end up being more frequent in the population. But I just want to make sure you guys understand that mutations are not created when they're needed. They're created through random mutations, right? So sometimes good ones are created, sometimes bad ones are created, sometimes silent mutations are created. Remember all that stuff you learned about mutations. Okay, so here's an example. We're going to think about a population of beetles, okay? And in this population of beetles, there's a genetically determined trait of coloration of the beetle, okay? So imagine that in a population, everybody is green, okay, and has the green allele, 2 copies of it. Well, somehow a mutation occurred through a random mistake and created a new allele, a big B allele, that coded for brown. Okay, notice, this is a dominant allele. That's the mutation. This can totally happen. There are definitely cases of that. This one's a made-up one. But now that allele has come about, it's now in the population and has changed the population. Instead of being all green, now there are some brown beetles. Okay, and notice it wasn't because these beetles needed to be brown. It's just that mutation randomly occurred. Okay, so that takes care of those first two things. So individuals within a population vary, right? So not everybody has the same genetically determined characteristics, and traits are passed from parent to offspring. Okay, so then he also noticed that some individuals fail to survive and reproduce. Okay? Another way of saying this is that in most populations, there is an overproduction of offspring. So that means most populations produce many more offspring than are required to replace the parents, and produce more offspring than can possibly survive. Okay? There's a struggle for existence. Predators, diseases, competition, all sorts of things are taking out individuals within the population at all times, working to kill them off. Okay, so it's hard to survive out in nature. Not everybody does. That's just what that is saying. And then there's also unequal reproductive success. Okay, so some individuals fail to reproduce, and that's unequal reproductive success. Reproductive success is just simply the ability to pass your genes on to the next generation in a way that they can also pass the genes on, right? So having viable offspring that survive long enough to reproduce themselves, that's having good reproductive success. Okay? So an individual in a population can have good reproductive success if they create lots of offspring. Those offspring survive and reproduce lots of offspring. On the other hand, you could have low reproductive success if you don't have any offspring. That's very low reproductive success, right? You're not passing your genes on at all. Or maybe you just have a few offspring and they have a few offspring, so you're not reproducing very many. Or you could maybe even produce a lot, but maybe they're weak and they don't survive very well to be able to reproduce themselves. Okay, so some individuals within a population reproduce more, some reproduce less, some not at all. there's variation, right? So it's unequal. Okay. This is often called differential survival and reproduction. And a lot of times people have this idea, like natural selection is survival of the fittest, when it's not really survival so much. It's really all about reproduction, okay? Because this is about passing your genes on to the next generation. Okay, it really doesn't matter how long you survive. It matters how much you reproduce or what your reproductive success is, right? So, say with these beetles, ones that have a high reproductive success might not actually even live that long. Maybe they just mate and die. A lot of insects do that, but as long as they pass their genes on, then they have high reproductive success. Okay, so it's really all about reproduction when it comes to natural selection, because we're talking about passing the genes on to the next generation, which of course occurs during reproduction. Okay, and then finally, survival and reproduction are not determined by chance. Sometimes they are, but in many cases, reproductive success depends on genetically determined characteristics or what alleles you have. Okay? And remember, within the population, not everybody has the same traits, so some may have traits that make them better adapted to a given environment, while others have traits that don't. Okay, so individuals with beneficial traits survive, and reproduce more. Okay, and that means that those beneficial alleles increase in frequency within the population, and the less beneficial alleles decrease in frequency within the population. Okay, so this is, differential reproduction means that those with traits that make them better adapted to the environment are able to survive long enough to reproduce and do a good job of passing their genes on. Okay, so here's an example back with the beetles. Okay, remember our genetically diverse population of beetles, where some are brown and some are green, and these ones are, big B, little b, and these are little b, big B, little b, etc. With the big B. I'll just draw them all in there. Be clear. With the big B, little b ones being brown, and the little b ones being green. Okay. So the idea is that, if you have a predator, say, eating some more of the say the green beetles, then the brown beetles are going to become more common, and with that, the brown allele will become more common, okay, and the green allele will become less common. Okay, so here is a summary of natural selection. It's really a straightforward idea. Okay, there's variation in a population of organisms. We're talking about beetles with the beetle color, right? And that it goes along with the alleles. Big B is brown and little b is green, right? So for that coloration gene, there are two alleles. Okay. Some variants, meaning some of the organisms with some alleles survive. They're more likely to survive than others. Okay. Here we have these birds, right? These birds are eating some of the beetles. Why are they're eating the green ones? Why are they eating the green ones? Well, presumably because these brown ones, are well camouflaged. It's much easier to see the green ones than the brown ones. Okay. Then the survivors reproduce. Okay, so brown parent and brown parent make lots of brown babies. A green parent and a brown parent make some brown and some green. Okay. And then the population, the resulting population after that reproduction is now more brown than it was over here, right? So the population has evolved and now contains more individuals with the selected trait, okay? And that just keeps happening over and over again. And after many rounds, i.e. many years or many generations, the entire population has the selected trait, or in this case, they're brown, okay? So this means that the frequency of the green allele versus the brown allele has changed over time, right? So here, maybe the B allele and the little b allele are equal. And here, there's many more big B alleles than little b alleles, right? Because the population is more brown. So just reaching back to our remembering that evolution is genetic change over time, or change in allele frequency over time, right? So obviously we see a characteristic change, right? And that reaches back to the genetic cause of it, which is an allele frequency change. Okay, so natural selection, to summarize in words, means that individuals within a population with genetically determined traits, meaning alleles, that make them better adapted to their environment, survive and reproduce more than other individuals within the population. Individuals that have beneficial alleles, meaning that they infer, an advantage, reproduce more, and the beneficial alleles are passed on to the next generation, meaning they become more frequent. And then the opposite is true. So individuals that don't possess these beneficial alleles, they reproduce less, or maybe not at all, and their alleles are not passed on to the next generation. All right, here's a couple terms that we need to know that we'll be talking about and throwing around. The first is the idea of evolutionary fitness. Okay, this is different than, fitness like going to work out and you get really strong. Evolutionary fitness instead is a measure of an organism's ability to pass on its genes, or you could say a measure of an organism's reproductive success, right? Because that's how they're going to pass on their genes. Okay. An organism that has high evolutionary fitness is going to do a good job of reproducing, passing on its genes, making strong offspring that will also pass their genes on. And the opposite, an individual with low evolutionary fitness would either not reproduce very much, not reproduce at all, or maybe reproduce a lot but have really weak offspring. Okay. So that's important. Note, it is not about how long something lives necessarily, or how strong it is, or how smart it is. Okay, those things can come into play, but they're not necessarily related. Okay, you could have an organism live a really short lifespan, but spend the whole time mating and passing its genes on. It could have high fitness. Okay. All right, and then there's the idea of a selective factor, also called a selection factor or a selective pressure. I put all three of those there. Selection factor, or selective factor, selection factor, and selective pressure, because they're really used interchangeably, and I'll probably use all of them. It is the thing or the factor in the environment that determines fitness. In other words, it is the thing in the environment that allows some organisms or some individuals to reproduce better than others and pass their genes on more frequently. And then beneficial traits or alleles, those ones that confer a selective advantage, are selected for by the selection factor, right? So the selection factor is going to select what traits are good and select for those and get rid of the other ones. Okay. If a trait is selected for by the selection factor, that means it stays in the population. So selected for, it stays in the population and becomes more frequent over time. Detrimental traits, or ones that are not beneficial, are selected against. Okay, that means that they are removed from the population, right? And they'll, as a result, would become less frequent over time within that population. Okay, so back to these beetles and their bird enemies. Okay, so yeah, green beetles are favorite. They like the green ones. They can see the green ones better. Many generations. And we have those brown beetles again, right? Okay, so let's think about these terms that we just worked through. So the selective factor, the selection factor, or the selective pressure, that's the predation by the birds. Okay, in this case, it's a pretty straightforward one, right? Because obviously the birds are eating some of the beetles. The beetles that are being eaten cannot reproduce, right? So, they're not going to pass their genes on. It could be something a little less obvious, though. Like food availability or temperature, anything that's in the environment that can give some individuals a little bit of an advantage can act as a selection factor. And in nature, there are many selection factors working on a population at a time, right? So it's not just a population of beetles. that are being eaten by birds. That's not the only selection factor. They could also have diseases going after them. They could have competition with each other. They got all sorts of things, other predators, etc. Okay. The trait that's selected for in this case is the brown coloration. Okay, these are the ones that are not eaten and that stay in the population. Okay. And this means that the brown color allele will become more frequent over time, and that's what we see, right? So when our population started out, in this case, it's mostly green with a few browns. After several generations, we're getting more browns, less green, and then eventually we have all brown ones. Why? Because the birds keep eating the green ones, taking that allele out. Okay, and the trait that's selected against in this case is the green coloration. Okay, and that's because those ones get eaten. Okay, so they are taken out of the population, and the green color allele will become less frequent in the population. Okay, the allele frequency changes over time, and the beetle population evolves to be better camouflaged or adapted to their environment. Okay. And this is just the basic thing that we see happening over and over again out in nature. There's a lot of studies that have documented this, and we can see it happening in real time as well for things like bacteria and some other organisms. Well, one thing to consider is that the environment is constantly changing. Okay, so for this population of beetles here, it is beneficial to be brown, right? Being green gets you eaten, and that's because, in the simplistic example, the background is brown, their habitat is brown, so the brown ones survive better. But what do you think would happen if the population of beetles started living on green leaves instead of on the bark? Then the things that are selected for would reverse, right? So if instead these beetles were found, or a population, say, moved to a new environment and the only thing to live on was the leaves, then being brown would be detrimental and being green would be beneficial. Okay? So one thing to just keep in mind when you're thinking about natural selection is that there isn't one certain end point. Populations are not trying to get to some high level of adaptation. It's just this process of weeding out the things that are not working and selecting for the things that are working. If the environment changes, then what works will change as well. And we'll be going through some examples in class as well.